Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Well, American Thanksgiving is with us, and so I thought it'd be really interesting to check in with Anita Nowak. She is a business school professor at McGill University, and she's written a book about empathy. And I think empathy is one of those things that, along with gratitude, are the things that we really think about during holiday season. And American Thanksgiving is one of those times when I think a lot of us, even in Canada, have to sit back and think about what we're grateful for and some of those attitudes that we should have to be more empathetic. So Anita Novak, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's always a pleasure.
So what's the book? It's called Purposeful Empathy?
Yes, tapping our hidden superpower for personal, organizational, and social change. And it stemmed from my PhD research where I interviewed social entrepreneurs to understand why they do the work that they do. I was really interested in developing curriculum and pedagogy for the next generation of leaders to do good in the world. I'm very interested in social impact. And what they all had in common was this motivation to act on the empathy that they felt for others who were suffering or marginalized in some ways. And so I didn't set out to study empathy. It found me. But when I realized how powerful empathy can be in our lives, I've spent sort of the last 15 years going down a deep rabbit's hole. And I recognize now that empathy is not only important in our personal lives and in the broader world, but also very much so in leadership and corporate culture as well.
So I can understand that it's important in personal lives and maybe in social enterprise, but you teach at a business school. Is it important in business?
Yes, it is. In fact, I just got back from a conference in Stockholm. It's called the IDG Summit, IDG standing for Inner Development Goals. So probably most of your listeners would be familiar with the SDGs, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which were created some years ago to sort of be a roadmap for where the world needed to go to create a more peaceful, just, and sustainable world. Unfortunately, I think the latest UN report is that we're like 12% on track. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done between now and 2030 to achieve the goals. And so a group of people said, well, if leaders are expected to create change in the outer world, is there maybe some opportunity for them also to create inner change? And so they developed 23 skills. And I encourage anybody to Google sort of inner development goals, and you can see the framework. And empathy and compassion is one of the leadership skills. When I go into corporate settings, and I get asked all the time, we're a high performance culture. It sounds nice to have empathic leadership, but like that might get in the way, slow us down. We won't hit our KPIs. I actually literally stop them in their tracks and say just the opposite. Regardless of sector or industry or place on the planet, whether it's for-profit, nonprofit, government, doesn't matter. Every organization has one thing in common, and that is people. There's always people inhabiting those organizations, and people want to come to a workplace where they feel valued for whatever gifts we bring to the table and feel included in a sense of belonging. And empathy is paramount to that. Empathy is critical for bottom line stuff like absenteeism, presenteeism, turnover, mental health, sick days, like everything that has to do with how we as human beings show up in the workplace can be improved by more empathic cultures and more empathic leaders. And it's the social capital that actually allows organizations to thrive because when there's more trust, better communication, there's all sorts of opportunities for innovation. There's less expenses around mitigating conflict. So I have made the business case for empathy. And I think that there's a lot of other skills in the inner landscape of our lives that I think we need to turn our attention towards to be better parents, better citizens, better leaders. So I think there's a lot of work ahead of us.
And this is what the book is all about?
Yes, it is. It's about understanding that if we turn up the volume of empathy in our lives, not only does it improve relationships around us, but it also benefits us. There's hard science that shows when we are in an empathic connection, that the pleasure and the reward centers of our brain light up, just like when we're eating chocolate cake or if we're high on psychedelics even. And also physiologically, our breathing stabilizes. The stress hormones like cortisol that give us all sorts of inflammation and chronic diseases, they go down. When we're feeling emotionally connected, what takes place is that serotonin and oxytocin go up. So those are the feel-good hormones that actually allow us to feel connected in a sense of belonging. And that is something that humans need to flourish. They've done research with babies in orphanages. If a baby is held X number of minutes a day, it'll survive childhood illness better than if it's not. So we need communion. We need to feel connected to thrive.
How do you turn up empathetic attitudes and personality?
Yeah, it's one way is just to make the decision. It's a story that I share often just to bring home the point. When I was learning about the neuroscience of empathy, and the fact that we could actually decide to become more empathic by thinking more empathic thoughts and behaving in more empathic ways. And that's because we have what's known as brain plasticity, where we can change the neural connections in our brain, and then we can have different responses to circumstances. I started to do a lot of experiments. And I have this very strong, vivid memory, even though it happened like 15 years ago, being in a long lineup at a store where I was going to send a package in the mail. And it took 30 minutes to get to the counter, and I just wanted to get out of there. And the woman who greeted me at the counter was rude, like just really unnecessarily rude. And it triggered me. I was just like, how dare you talk to me like that? But instead, what I did is I looked at her and I said, are you okay? And there was just this moment where she was trying to figure out whether or not I was being sarcastic or passive aggressive, but I was being sincere, and she knew it. And she burst into tears, Brian. She said, I have been working double shifts for 2 weeks. My son is at home with a fever, and I think I'm getting sick. It's 3 p.m. I haven't had a lunch break. I'm just exhausted. And, 10 seconds earlier, I really didn't like this woman. And then I found myself holding her hands across the counter, and both of us were teary-eyed because I know what it's like to be exhausted like she was. And that's the reason why she was rude. That's not her core nature. So I think one of the big decisions we all need to take is that we can choose to be empathic. And I think the invitation is find ways in your day to be more empathic, and then it becomes more second nature. The only problem with that, Brian, is that our brains cannot be in a state of anxiety and empathy simultaneously. It's not possible to our brains. So when we're emotionally triggered, it's very difficult to extend empathy to others.
What's the opposite of empathy?
Well, okay, I'll start with not quite the opposite, but something very different from empathy, and that is pity. So I actually put them on a continuum: pity, sympathy, compassion, and empathy. And on the pity side of that equation, there is power asymmetry embedded in the relationship. You look down on somebody you pity. And empathy is not that. Empathy is the recognition that we share a common humanity. We all know feelings like shame or disappointment or hope. And that's what unites us in the common experience of what it means to be a human. So empathy is what unites us, with an important caveat, and that is that we don't deny lived experience. Like, everybody has different ways of dealing with those different emotions. But pity is very different from that. Pity is, oh, you poor person, I look down on you. And there's a lot of research showing that the higher up you climb any organizational structure, or the more power or influence or money you accrue in a system, the less empathy that you tend to have. So we have to also work hard to mitigate against that.
So I would have thought that the opposite of empathy is something like narcissism or something like that. Someone that's very self-oriented and only interested in themselves. Are we naturally narcissistic, or are we naturally empathetic?
We are 100% naturally empathetic. There are people who have studied our evolution. So let's go back 40,000 years ago. We were not the only large brain species roaming the planet. There were 4 or 5 other large brained creatures, but we are the ones that survived. And the people who study our evolution look at some of the physical changes that happen to our bodies and have come to the conclusion that empathy and collaboration are the key factors that allowed us to survive and thrive. And I think they remain the key factors. So, for example, a lot of our facial hair, I know you still have some, but most of our facial hair dropped off. And relatively speaking, our testosterone dropped relative to those other creatures. The biggest one for me is the whites of our eyes grew very large. So there are bigger mammals than us on the planet, but ratio, we have the biggest whites of our eyes. And the reason why they think that's important is that it's really a matter of being able to read each other's facial expression and, eye expressions in order to communicate and collaborate and understand each other, to help each other out against the elements. So essentially empathy and collaboration is what allowed us to thrive. So I think it is our core nature. I think a lot of the way we live in society makes it difficult for us to regularly empathize. And part of that is the stress that we all live in.
Where could one get your book if they're interested in checking you out?
Any of the Amazons or Chapters, Indigo, all the usual places to buy the book.
And remind us the title.
It's called Purposeful Empathy, Tapping Our Hidden Superpower for Personal, Organizational, and Social Change. And one of the things is, you mentioned Thanksgiving. Will you indulge a little exercise that I think people could think about when they go into a family gathering over the holiday season, when they're feeling emotionally triggered by an uncle that says something terrible?
I'd love to, but can we take a break for some messages first and come back and do that?
Let's do it.
We're going to take 2 minutes and come back with Anita Nowak, a business school professor at McGill University, who's written this book about purposeful empathy. And we're going to talk about empathy at holidays, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the book and what's included and what it's going to teach us. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest today is Anita Nowak. She is a business school professor at the School of Business at McGill University. She's just published a book called Purposeful Empathy, and we've been talking a little bit about empathy, and I'm going to question her a little bit more about whether it really is natural or not, but she seems to think that it's one of the keys to our success and our superpower. You were talking just before the break, Anita, about Thanksgiving, American Thanksgiving, Christmas holidays, et cetera, and that you can get triggered, you can get stressed, et cetera. And you said you had some exercises to help us get through those situations. Tell us about it, please.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to share an example from the workplace that we can all relate to that has application at a dining room table when family members are saying things and we're feeling the emotional triggers of our childhood. So let's imagine, choose the name of a boss. Go for it so we can work with this person.
Harry.
Terry?
Harry.
Harry. So Harry is at a business meeting and he's being raked over the coals. His numbers are low. He's feeling a degree of shame about how he hasn't performed, and it's now public. Okay, so Harry walks out of that meeting and there's like a sense of his stomach churning, and he's really upbraiding himself in his brain. He's thinking, why didn't I do this better? And that felt awful. And he's being reminded of how he felt rejected back in high school. So all these things are playing out in his head. Okay. And he's not necessarily conscious of it, but he's feeling icky. Goes to his office and he's back at his laptop, trying to get through some emails, and he gets a knock on the door. And it's one of his employees that comes in and says, Harry, do you have a minute? And at that moment, Harry, do you have a minute? That means that there's an important conversation that's going to follow. So Harry says, come on in. And Sally says, listen, I have an issue. We're moving my mom into a home because she's finally ready, and she's got early stage dementia. It's been a long haul, and I need a couple of days off to help her pack and move. And you're in your mind thinking, oh my gosh, this is the worst possible time for her to take a couple of days off. We have big deliverables. And you're frustrated. Harry's frustrated about the meeting and how it went, but he knows that he needs to be empathic in that moment for Sally. So there's 6 steps that I invite people to think about in order to get from a place of stress to a place of empathy and empathic leadership. So the first is self-awareness. So in our culture, we are very, very adept at thinking thoughts and listening to our thoughts. But we don't have a lot of practice listening to our bodies. And they give us, our body gives us cues all the time. Do we have butterflies in our stomach? Is our mouth chalk? Are we breathing fast? Are we speaking with more faster cadence? All those things suggest we're feeling stress. So the first is to actually pay attention to what our body is telling us, have self-awareness. Second step is to then practice some self-regulation, which is a fancy word for how can I take the level of stress that I'm feeling down a notch or 2 or 3 or 4. And one of the simplest, easiest ways to do this, and nobody needs to know you're doing it, is through something called box breathing, where you take in a deep breath for a count of 4 or 5, you hold for a count of 4 or 5, you breathe out for a count of 4 or 5, and then you hold for a count of 4 or 5. And you do that repeatedly 3 or 4 times, and that actually kicks in your parasympathetic nerve system so that you're feeling less stressed in order to do what I call bridge crossing. So the third step is bridge crossing, where it's just a simple decision in your mind to get out of your own headspace and meet somebody where they're at. So the earlier story that I talked about where this woman at the counter was rude to me and then I said, "How are you okay?" That was bridge crossing, making the decision that it's not about me, it's about someone else. The fourth step is perspective taking. And that is holding space for someone else to share without judgment and without making it about you. So in that moment, silence is golden, because when people are sharing, they don't want to be interrupted. They don't want to be told, 50 different ways to manage the problem. They just want to be listened to. And the second piece of gold in that is repeating back what you just heard, just a few words to someone who's speaking. If you repeat back a few words that you just heard, it's like a balm. So that's the fourth step, holding space, perspective taking. The fifth step in this moment is Harry has a decision to make. He knows that Sally's taking a couple of days off. He knows that the work has to be redistributed. But is that the moment, as she's just telling her story about her mom, is that the moment to say, okay, let's whip out our agendas? No. The empathic action, the step number 5, is to say to Sally, that's got to be tough. Thank you for trusting me to share that. Why don't you go take a walk or grab a glass of water or go speak to a friend and come back and see me when you're ready and we can talk about how we can figure out the work plan. When they have that as a gift and you've taken that empathic action, they come back engaged at a much higher level. The final step is self-empathy. So Harry, typically Sally would leave the office and Harry would go back to his emails. But Harry's been triggered by the bad meeting and this loaded conversation and never takes time for himself. So I think it's really important to also develop self-care practices and self-empathy practices that, allow us to not beat ourselves up and feel good in our bodies. And all of what I just described is applicable to the dining room table. So picture, you're at Thanksgiving or holiday season and somebody says something and it irritates the sister. And then, all of the old, dynamics of the family show up and you're feeling frustrated. You can walk yourself through that process. Know that you're feeling stressed. Take some deep breaths. Listen with an open heart. It changes the dynamics and it could make for a much more positive experience at the dinner table.
Anita, that's a fantastic 6-step program. And it's sort of like my mom always told me about take a deep breath or count to 10 before you, respond and take action. But it's pretty idealistic. A lot of people think that, when something bad happens and they get triggered, they have the right to explode. They have the right to react and talk about it right then and there, and demand that you talk about it right then and there, not walk to go talk to a friend or cool down or calm down. How do you get people out of the immediate trigger reaction mode?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, and I'm a work in progress. So even though I talk about it, doesn't mean that I've mastered this process at all. I could speak to my husband or my child. I was actually, I interviewed somebody for my podcast some time ago, and I was writing a piece about our conversation around children having tantrums or meltdowns and how to address them. And there's something known as self-regulation, where you actually, or co-regulation, where you help the child calm down. Now, what happens most of the time, I've lived through one tantrum in my life where my daughter just like was laying down on the floor with her legs in the air. And this was at a shopping mall. It was like the whole cliche. It only happened once, but it brought so much shame to me. And I think when it's public, it seems like we can't parent very well if our kid is misbehaving. But one of the things that she shared is that typically people, including kids, behave poorly when some of their needs are not being met. Maybe they're hungry or they're tired, so that's a physical need. Or maybe they're feeling like they're not getting your attention because you're off doing errands and you're not paying attention. Or maybe you're checking your phone and so they want your attention. So typically the invitation to co-regulate with a child that's having a meltdown is to first recognize that the kid is not misbehaving by choice. The kid is not doing something intentional to frustrate you or upset you, but it probably has some unmet need. And that if we can be curious about that and do some deep breathing and not let it be about us, like that kid is shaming us, that kid is misbehaving on purpose, but really try to meet the child where the child is at, then it becomes an opportunity for co-regulation. So that's just salient because I was just writing about it. But I think the same thing holds in a space where you're talking with adults. If you're being triggered emotionally and you decide to react, that's normal. That's how our brains were designed. Our brains were not designed to hold space for somebody. Our brains were designed to respond with immediacy. And when we're feeling emotionally charged, we have the feeling of like, hey, I've got something to say back at you. But how helpful is that? How helpful is that? So, there are 3 parts of our brain that developed over time in our evolution, and they also develop in that order when we're in the womb. The first is the amygdala. It's called the brainstem or the reptilian brain. It is the thing in our brain that when we are facing some kind of trigger, that will react for us when we feel a threat in any way. So it's useful when we were back in the day on the savannas with the saber-toothed tiger to have the amygdala fire, because then we would run. But it's not very helpful to react in the same way when somebody has said something that just sort of rubs you the wrong way. And then we have like this reaction to it. We now have, thanks to, years and years and years of evolution, the prefrontal cortex, which allows us to do all the higher order thinking. So wouldn't it be helpful if we actually developed the skill to recognize when somebody has said something hurtful, that I'm triggered right now, and the way I want to respond might feel really good at the tip of my tongue, but in the long run, it might not be helpful. And this is something that I think as humans, we can develop and get better at, and evolve a relationship, evolve ourselves too. Not easy. And again, I'm like a work in progress. Ask my sisters.
And your book, is it going to take us through how we do this?
No, the book makes the case for more empathy in the world. It talks about why there's need for more empathic leadership, for sure. And then it also talks about sort of the political and spiritual nature of purposeful empathy. I believe that all social movements and social change has been helped by people engaging in purposeful empathy. If you think about abolition of slavery, or the decision to change laws so that we wouldn't have child labor anymore, or women's suffrage, we're giving women the right to vote. All of those things were underpinned by the sense of empathy for others, wanting more for other people. And so I think there's a political nature to empathy, and that I think in our culture, where a lot of it is about celebrity and fame and fortune, we have forgotten. We don't necessarily spend much of our collective time thinking about other people and other places. And I think we need to do more of that. So there's a political component. And then there's also a spiritual component to empathy. I think when we reflect deeply on our core values, and when we think about our lives at the end of our lives, what really, really matters. I think it's like we're not in regular contact with those core values. And I think empathy is one of those skills, habits, traits that if we turn up the volume in our lives, we live a more meaningful, purposeful life, a life of generosity, a life of kindness. And so there's a spiritual dimension also to empathy. So the invitation is, hey, we can do good in our workplaces and our families out in the world, and we also reap the benefits because we feel better.
You know, Anita, I'd like to believe you're right. And I guess I firmly, idealistically want you to be right, but I really question whether that's the reality in our world today, whether it's in politics or in business. Maybe we can come back after a break and I can challenge you a little bit and see what you have to say about that. Okay.
Sounds great.
We're going to take a break and be back in just 2 minutes with Anita Nowak, a business school professor at McGill University and author of Purposeful Empathy. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm really enjoying my chat tonight with Anita Nowak. She's a business school professor at McGill University, the business school there, and she's written a book called Purposeful Empathy. And you actually have a podcast that you do on your own on empathy, I understand. Is that correct?
Yes, weekly. It drops on Thursdays, and I speak to people from around the world who also understand that the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it.
I agree that we need more empathy, but it almost seems to me, Anita, that we've gone the opposite direction of late. We've got, a war in Ukraine. We've got Hamas, Israel. We've got issues in maybe the Asia Pacific. We've got, a new leader in Argentina that's strong man, right wing, populist. Same thing in the Netherlands. It looks like Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee. It seems like the strong man, unempathetic, autocratic individual is the one that is being elected and that people look to. They want the strong autocratic person, it would almost appear. And then in business, it's the head of Twitter, X, formerly known as Twitter, that people look at and say, this guy is the opposite of empathetic, but he's rich and successful. And example after example in the business world of people that are like that. You're a business school professor. A lot of people that go into business school are type A personalities and individuals. Are they empathetic? So do we have a world that is looking like empathy is the key superpower, or is actually the opposite true, where it's the autocratic, authoritarian, strong person that is the superpower?
Yeah, I think if you're a Star Wars fan, we're in episode, what is it, 5, where the Empire Strikes Back. I agree, all of that is happening. It is devastating to me, and it makes it hard to make the case. But I think, isn't it Nelson Mandela who said something about the moral arc of the universe is long, but it always bends towards justice? I think we may be in for not just a few years, but a couple of decades of real despair and upheaval between climate change and the gap between the rich and poor, automation, AI coming, people losing their jobs, like migration, wars, famine, like all of it does not bode well for humanity. And that's why when I was at this conference in Stockholm, I heard a quote that caught my attention, which was, "Times are urgent, we must slow down." And that caught my attention because I think it would be naive, and I used to think this way, let's change the systems, right? Let's change all the systems that have brought us to this moment. But I think the powers that be hold the systems in place. And the only way that we can create change, and has happened over time, who would have ever thought that women would get the right to vote when forever they were 0.5% person. Same thing with people who are enslaved. Same thing with the civil rights movement. Same thing with the gay rights movement. Like all these moments in time where we've ushered in a new era of more emancipation for people were thought of as impossible prior. And then it happened. And so I think we are in the momentum of sort of tragedy unfolding. We're seeing it. I mean, you just have to listen to the news in it, and we almost have to stop if we're not going to be overwhelmed by how much grief there is going on in the world. But individually, if we all play our part in being a kinder person, in our own circle of influence, our families, in our workplaces, there is I think a contagion effect. And I think we owe it to the next generation to at least try, not to be apathetic and not to say, well, what's going on with the world? Like, we need to develop agency and be intentional about sort of what our children are going to inherit. I think you wanted to invite me to read something from my book at one point, right?
Yes.
Yeah, maybe now's the time. So it's just a paragraph. Page 167, here we are. A few years ago, Greta Thunberg punctured our collective consciousness with her "How dare you" speech at the UN General Assembly. In some circles, she was celebrated for calling out world leaders. Others were appalled. How dare a kid, a girl no less, publicly upbraid statespeople like that? I believe that beneath a veneer of anger, one usually finds fear, pain, or grief. And viewed in that light, Greta's message ought to be understood as a cry for help. Greta wasn't the champion of a hostile social movement. She was the unlikely spokesperson for her generation, pleading for empathy and begging for action. The same holds true for education activist Malala Yousafzai, the teens behind March for Our Lives, and anyone who stood in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, or Me Too. These campaigns were not motivated by rebellion. They were inspired by the hopeful possibility of widespread purposeful empathy. And so I think we need leaders that understand that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it always bends towards justice, and lead from that. I think that's what's missing.
Too often, though, when we have leaders that act like that, they get described as, if they're male, as effeminate or weak, and too often the media, political parties, business organizations look up to the strong, non-empathetic leader. Like, am I completely wrong in that regard, or is it a, as you say, a arc that has gone the wrong way for a while, or what's happening?
I think the most defining moment for me, anyways, of Barack Obama's presidency, and I don't remember if it was in his first or second term, was the Sandy Hook, where children 5 years old, 20 of them were killed by somebody who opened fire in a school, and he wept when he spoke to the country about that. It showed deep humanity and deep compassion. And so, yes, there are people who like the strong man and have over time liked the strong man, because the strong man makes things simple. Here's the scapegoat, and here's the answer. And that involves othering. When we have a scapegoat, we're othering, and empathy breaks othering. So, for example, back in the day when we were trying to survive as, in our clan, the other clan was the threat. In all circumstances, the other creature was the threat. So we always tried to protect ourselves. We've continued to behave that way. We've evolved that way, where we have an in-group, the people who vote like us, look like us, eat like us, vote, cheer for the same team as us. It's easy for us to empathize with our in-group. It's not easy to empathize with our out-group. And when we scapegoat other people as they're the problem, we are othering. And, the language that's being used right now, for example, the vermin, I mean, that's not that's par exprès, that's on purpose, that Trump would call up that language, the language of Hitler, the language that was used in Rwanda pre-genocide. Like, it's a matter of dehumanizing the other. And that's what we have to fight against. That's the good, righteous fight, is to say, no, we can't see others just because they're different from us and see the world differently from us, that they're inferior to us.
I hope you're right. But it looks like right now he's going to be the next president of the United States. And so there's a lot of people that disagree with you and I, which is very concerning, and or maybe they're just attracted to that simple answer that you talked about. A last question on this topic. When you walk into a first year business school class and you've got all these people that, go into business school because they want to be investment bankers, they want to be rich, they want to be, really successful. Do they believe you?
Huh. Well, those who don't drop my class, because we do eye-gazing exercises. I mean, one of the first things that I do is I walk around the room to each student one at a time, and I crouch down, and it takes all the quad muscles that I have. And I look straight in the eye and I say, you are better than you think you are. And as I'm doing it one student at a time, it takes like maybe 10 minutes to get through the whole classroom. I know that some students are rolling their eyes in their heads. I know some students are like feeling super awkward and, but I also see some students wiping away tears and will tell me at the end of the semester that they've never felt that a professor cared for them the way I showed I care for them. So there's this famous Maya Angelou quote that says, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they will not forget how you made them feel. And, when you go out on a date, you have a repartee, it's how you feel on the date that makes you want to go out on the date again. I think we need to value what we bring to each other and how we are generous to each other. So I think, business school students also have rich emotional lives and complex lives, right? And some of them are confused. They think they want to be an accountant and realize that they actually don't. And that's okay too. I think the undergrad experience can be an opportunity to realize, like, hey, you know what? All this business stuff might not be completely aligned with my values or my innate traits. So I think I might short circuit some worldviews. I might challenge a few worldviews and confuse a few students, and that's okay. That's part of what it means to be an undergrad.
Fascinating conversation. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes with Anita Nowak about purposeful empathy. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. With the holidays coming, American Thanksgiving, I thought it'd be really interesting to chat with Anita Nowak, who is a business school professor at McGill University in their business school there, who's written a book called Purposeful Empathy, Tapping Our Hidden Superpower for Personal, Organizational, and Social Change, available on Amazon and everywhere good books are sold, I guess is the line that I should be saying. And it's been interesting because I struggle with this. As I think I mentioned to you before, Anita, I'm struggling to finish my doctorate in business, and I have my topic is social capital, which is sort of comparable to what you're talking about. It's one of those things where some people agree and some people vehemently disagree. We've got some challenges to empathy and social capital the last couple of years because of the things we've been talking about, but also because of the pandemic, where we were not meeting as often. I interviewed one person who said one of the challenges with high school students and university people that had spent their whole either high school life or university life online, they didn't create that social connectiveness, and therefore, we're robbed of a development stage in empathy. Do you think that's a problem?
100%. I mean, besides the mental health issues and the loneliness epidemic, we have to learn how to socialize together, and the mentorship that was missed and all the all the stickiness that happens between people. I mean, seeing each other on Zoom and then having the little chat on the side and then doing your emails on the side, like that doesn't create, a bond between people. That's why I was always asked, after the first wave, when people were starting to come back into the office, I was get asked, so what should we do in order to sort of bring our community of employees together? And I said, go for a beer. Like bring back the birthday cakes, even if they, terrible supermarket birthday cakes, like allow people to congregate outside of their roles because we're social human beings. It can't all be just about the work. So that was my my opinion at the time. And it continues to be like, we need to have the conversations. I had a boss once who told me he's an ENTJ just like me. And so we want to just like get straight to the agenda item, like all this small talk at the beginning of a meeting drives us bananas. And he said when he started working for a new organization, he inherited an assistant who wanted to talk to him throughout the day, like just wanted more and more and more of him, till he realized if he started his day coming into the office and spending first 10 minutes just listening to her and connecting with her, the rest of the day she was as efficient as could be. So there is something to, feeling our humanity before our roles and responsibilities. And we just need leadership to understand that.
You wanted to tell me a story about an air flight.
Just to end on a note of, leaning into purposeful empathy. I was on my book tour and the very first flight I took got canceled. So I was flying to Boston. I was like, oh man, maybe this is like, okay, get the glitch out of the way early. And I wasn't presenting that night. I was presenting the next day. So it wasn't that tragic a deal. But of course, all of us from the flight went over to the customer care agents, and there were two of them. And one was senior and one was being trained in real time. And I saw a woman go up to her guy saying, I have got to get to Boston. Like, you got to get me to Boston now. And she was extremely, extremely rude to her customer care agent. And I guess I just had the headspace of like, this is a beginning for me. I can be gentle. I can be kind. But I know what it's like. If I had been like, if I needed to get to my book event that night, I might have been her. So I think all over the place, we're watching people behave poorly and kindly. And we can decide not to escalate a circumstance, to de-escalate it by showing a little bit more empathy. And you never know what could open up. You can never know. Like, I still have this memory. If you have one more minute, Brian, you have one more minute?
Yes.
I remember getting into an altercation with a woman over a parking spot. And I looked at her and I said, is this who you are on a Monday morning? And I walked away, and it was the kind of thing where she had sworn at me, and I'd never been sworn at before. I was like really agitated. 2 minutes later, she comes back to me and she says, that's not who I am on a Monday morning. And she was devastated. She really profusely apologized to me. And somehow or other, I don't know how, Brian, 2 weeks later, I get an email from her. She tracked me down somehow. And she said, I went home that day and I spoke to my husband about how I reacted to you. And my husband and I decided that, you know what, the big city, Montreal, is not for us. So they moved back out east to a smaller town. They changed their life thanks to that little moment, So I think we should all look for moments.
Remind us the name of the book.
Kindness. The name of the book is Purposeful Empathy. It would be a great stocking stuffer.
Fantastic. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you, Anita Nowak, for joining us, and thank you, all of you, for joining us. I remind you all, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Montreal, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videocasts are available on my website, briancrombie.com. Good night, everybody.